If doctors told us that we'd made a breakthrough on COVID-19, we would rejoice. We'd feel hope that we could live our lives again, get back to work, back to doing what we want. Well, masks are a ticket to that freedom. We can help protect others and save lives by covering our noses and mouths, which is how the virus mainly spreads. Until there's a vaccine, grab the breakthrough that's already here. When we're out, it's masks on. A message to help keep you safe.
Brought to you by the Ad Council.
February 1901. If we had waited for the National League to do something for us, we would have remained a minor league forever. The American League will be the principal organization of the country within a very short time. Mark my prediction. Ban Johnson.
Byron Bancroft Ban Johnson was a big man with even bigger ambitions. A professor's son, Johnson became a sports writer for the Cincinnati Commercial Gazette, then took over a struggling minor league circuit called the Western League in 1894 and made it a financial success. In 1900, he changed its name to the American League and began to talk of moving east, to challenge the big city monopoly of Albert Goodwill Spaulding's troubled National League. He promised honest baseball, cheaper ticket prices, and a wholesome family atmosphere. At first, the National League owners simply ignored him. When he asked to address their annual meeting, they kept him waiting in the hall, then adjourned without even giving him a hearing. It was a major miscalculation. Johnson was humorless and dictatorial. He looked, one reporter said, as if he had been weaned on an icicle. But he was also able, resourceful, and determined. When the National League dropped 4 of its less profitable teams, Johnson saw his chance. He established new clubs in Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, snapped up newly unemployed players, then began raiding active National League rosters. Lured by an average of $500 more per season, 111 National League players jumped to Ban Johnson's brand-new American League, including the great pitchers Cy Young and Rube Waddell and the notorious John McGraw. By the end of the 1902 season, even Spaulding's Guide to Baseball admitted that the American League has more star players and can furnish a better article of baseball than the National League.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey there, everybody. How are you? My name is Tim Hanlon, that is, and I am your host, your congenial host, the hostess with the mostest, if you will. Of course, it's Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. It's our weekly duty for us to join you to help you go back, way back in this case, this week, in time, as we try to remember and regale and roll around in and learn maybe a few things along the way about various things in the realm of pro sports history and culture and all that stuff, and enjoy, learn, and just add to the trove of interest and curiosity that we like to serve up for you in audio form into your earbuds. Thank you very much for joining us. If it's your first time here, welcome aboard. If you've been here before, thanks for coming back. As you know, we kind of go back and forth across various sports, various points in time, obviously things that are recently departed, but all the way back to some of the things that are arguably historical and sort of dusty, and maybe more forensic, so to speak. It doesn't really matter when. And it doesn't really matter what. We just kind of get into it, especially if there's a good story attached. And this week is a really good example of going into the Wayback Machine. In this case, 1900. Way back when, yes. While it seems like that may be a little sort of ancient, given today's modern sports cornucopia that we love and enjoy, as we've learned in all of our various explorations, there are lots of different themes that are literally, they keep repeating themselves. And contraction, for example, something that we see in leagues all the time, was very much front and center, perhaps maybe for the first most, I guess, explosive example. In our episode, in our conversation this week with Bob Bailey, he a SABR, longtime SABR member and the author of a fascinating article that's part of a really equally fascinating book that just came out from our friends at the University of Nebraska Press. The book is called SABR, 50 at 50. And SABR, of course, is the Society for American Baseball Research. And this is just this tome that just came out in September. It's basically kind of like an ESPN 30 for 30 thing, but done in written form. And it features 50 of perhaps some of the most interesting and representative writings in SABR's history. That is the repository, if you will, of some of the best research in the sport of baseball. Bob Bailey has penned an article, actually from 1990, but is included in this book. And it provides the background for what we're going to talk about today, as you heard in a little clip. We go back to 1900, and the discussion is around the National League at that time, the burgeoning National League, up to 12 teams, and having become essentially the center of professional baseball itself, having become sort of the I guess the gelling, if you will, of a relatively ragtag amateur to professional series of events over the decades prior to become what was literally the center of professional baseball. And professional was kind of still in quotes, really, because it was just starting to gel around this time. And in 1900, the National League was kind of in trouble. They had bloated to 12 franchises, and not all of them were strong. And there were a bunch of other things going on, including competition, as you got a hint from that clip, featuring the dulcet tones of the late John Chancellor, he of NBC Nightly News fame back in the day, and the narrator from the essential 10-part now series, baseball series, by Ken Burns from the 1990s. And that's from inning number 2 in that series. And it literally gets into, or sort of hints at, the contraction of the National League in 1900 and the arrival and the opening of doors, shall we say, for a new league, what soon became known as the American League, and Ban Johnson taking advantage. And obviously before the decade of the aughts was out, the Grand Alliance, if you will, the master relationship between what is now still today the National League and this, in this case, new and fledgling American League. And this is sort of all of the intrigue that's wrapped up in the story this week. And in particular, our guest Bob Bailey is going to talk about not only the reduction of the 4 teams to go from 12 to 8, but also as part of those 4 teams, by the way, those would be the elimination of teams in Baltimore, Cleveland, Washington, D.C., and Louisville. And in particular, let us see here. We'll make sure we get these statistics right. The teams were the Cleveland Spiders, which we've talked about in a previous episode, the Baltimore Orioles, one of the original versions, the 19th century version that played from 1882 to 1899, no relation to the current franchise, and the Washington Senators themselves, also the 19th century version, and no relation to the various forms of senators or nationals, for that matter, that came ever since. All of those teams, the Cleveland Spiders, the then Baltimore Orioles, the then Washington Senators, and the last team that also got squeezed out but also never came back, to see baseball ever again on the top tier professional level, the Louisville Colonels. All of those 4 teams actually joined the National League from this thing called the American Association a number of years earlier, which we've talked about in some previous episodes. But the National League had basically assembled lots of different things, including these 4 former American Association franchises, and now found themselves to be a little too big for their own success and their own financial capabilities. And we're going to get into the sort of the drama around how the league had to kind of trim down, why that was the case, why these 4 franchises, and why Louisville, of those 4, essentially wound up becoming the odd man out going forward. As we'll learn in our conversation with Bob in just a few moments, Louisville was very much in the mix to ultimately go to the American League, because as Ban Johnson basically went after this contraction, he went after at least 3 of those markets and created new franchises in those markets that the National League contracted out of. So you saw teams now newly come into Baltimore, into Washington, D.C., and into Cleveland with the birth of the American League for real in 1902, 1903 or so. But Louisville did indeed, there is evidence, there is historical evidence that there was conversations in the case of telegrams and written correspondence and some other manners of discussion. But Louisville, alas, never sort of was able to get its act together, nor the American League's attention to finally get a renewed top-tier major league franchise. And that was the story, the contraction of the Louisville Colonels, as well as the 3 other teams. As we get into the National League in 1900, 4 teams out, basically, is kind of the phrase we can sort of throw to this with our guest this week, Bob Bailey, as we go back into some seminal stuff in baseball's early and very important history. This week in our conversation, coming up in just a few moments' time. Stay tuned. It's really interesting stuff, and we always try to keep it interesting, of course. What is also interesting, of course, this year, this holiday season, will be, unfortunately, like no other. And it's going to be interesting and challenging, and the gift-giving thing is going to be especially difficult, especially if you're going to decide to not necessarily shop in person, or you want to order from afar and have things shipped to you or to your loved ones or your friends. And we're here to help you in your, hopefully earlier than usual, holiday shopping for the sports fan in your life. And if it's that particular type of sports fan, of course, the one like us who loves to revel in all things forgotten and defunct and previously domiciled, well, you've come to the right place, not only in terms of content, of course, this little show, but also in terms of commerce. We've got some great sponsors, as you may have heard if you've listened to some of these shows in the past. And we've got 5 of them here for you that we're just going to sort of list in order with some promo codes to get your holiday shopping done early and often. Use these promo codes, why don't you, to save some bucks and get the sports fan in your life, sports fans in your life, the stuff that they really want. That is the realm of things from the world of defunct and forgotten sports franchises. So here we go. Get your pens and papers ready. Write this down because this is going to come in handy in the next couple of weeks for sure. StreakerSports.com, the purveyors of sports culture. Lots of tremendous stuff across all kinds of forgotten leagues and other forms of pop/sports culture. Promo code GOODSEATS gets you 15% off all of your purchases at StreakerSports.com. SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. You want a better shopping experience for great memorabilia from all kinds of teams and leagues no longer with us, and you just can't handle eBay or just take that chance, especially when it comes to a holiday gift giving? SportsHistoryCollectibles.com is the place to go. Check them out. Well photographed and just a treasure trove of stuff, new stuff every week. Promo code GOODSEATS will get you 15% off there at, again, SportsHistoryCollectibles.com. How about throwback jerseys? Yeah, sure, that and shirts as well. 503 Sports is the place for those. 503-sports.com. Again, 503- don't forget the dash, sports.com. We got a promo code there for you, and that's SEATS. And that's going to get you 10% off all of your purchases there at 503-sports.com. How about oldschoolshirts.com? Yeah, you just want the t-shirts, but not only of teams and leagues of yore, but also how about from radio stations and malls and amusement parks and all kinds of fun stuff. Things that you just plain old forgot, but in classic and well-crafted t-shirt form. It's oldschoolshirts.com. 10% off all of your purchases when you use the promo code there, and that's Good Seats. Good Seats, that's the promo code at oldschoolshirts.com. And last, but certainly not least, if you enjoy football memorabilia and you love mini helmets, high quality, these are like legit helmets, but in miniature form, perfect for your bookshelf, your desk, for whatever your football fans furniture situation's all about. These wonderfully crafted mini helmets from 417helmets.com. It's 417helmets.com. It's collectible helmets and more. When you go there early and often, use the promo code GOODSEATS for 10% off all of your purchases. And it's not just football teams of current as well as the past, but also all kinds of other stuff. If you want you've got a logo or a business or some other item or thing that you want to cherish and remember or just celebrate in the form of a mini helmet, and a smart looking one at that, go to 417helmets.com and they'll create some custom stuff for you too. And again, Good Seats, that promo code will get you 10% off all those things too. So there you go. There's 5 great sites to check out early and often for your holiday shopping. And please, by all means, use those promo codes. You'll give us a few dimes and nickels of love by doing so. And you'll also be showing our great sponsors that you not only listen to the show, but you've been moved not only to tears, but to actually go to the website and actually make a few purchases. We appreciate it. Our sponsors appreciate it. And we thank you kindly and wish you, of course, nothing but the best for the upcoming holiday season, challenging and unique as it may wind up being. All right, well, let's not dwell on those challenges, shall we? Let's get into some fun conversation this week with our guest, Bob Bailey. And let's get into oldie time baseball. It's 1900 and the National League. Time of crisis. Time to contract. Let's get into the intrigue behind all of it. Here's our conversation. Please enjoy. So I'm thumbing through the SABR 50 at 50 book from our friends at University of Nebraska Press. And this is a tremendous trove. And I, with all due respect, I am not sort of a traditional sort of baseball historian, nor even baseball statistic nerd or any of that kind of stuff, right? But I'm always fascinated, at least for me, about the situations like teams and leagues that aren't around. And lo and behold, I stumbled on your article from, I guess, the early 90s about the reduction of teams in the National League in 1900. Now, that sounds musty and old and like, who cares? But it's a fascinating story that I didn't know about. And that's why I reached out to you. And in particular, having lived in the city of Louisville for a period of time over my career, to know that Louisville actually had a Major League Baseball team. Didn't know that either. So why don't we set up the story here? Tell me about your involvement in SABR to start with and the genesis of this piece that's in this new 50 for 50 book.
Well, I've been a member of the Society for American Baseball Research since the early 1980s. So it's closing in on 40 years now. I stumbled on them at the Hall of Fame when the SABR president was the historian at the Hall of Fame. In any event, when I joined, it was fascinating to read the baseball research journals and the newsletters and whatnot. And as you say, a whole new world opened up. I grew up outside of New York City and knew all about the 50s, 60s, and 70s of baseball there. But this goes back to the 1840s when you talk about the pre-professional leagues and whatnot. And I was living in Louisville at the time, and stumbled on some material written in the 1940s about Louisville's major league period from 1876 to 1900, and just started to ask questions about it and trying to figure out what went on, who were the players, were they a good team, a bad team? They turned out to be, in most years, a pretty terrible team, but they did win one pennant. They were a founding team of the National League in 1876 and of the American Association in 1882. So this story came up with, if they're not a member now of the Major League, why not? So you just start thumbing through the newspapers and the microfilm reels to see if you can figure out what that story was.
So, okay, before we sort of get into that story itself, what drives you to do so? Like what's your sort of background, or your professional, or your familial, or all that kind of stuff? Like why is this, why SABR in the first place, and why does this become sort of, I don't call it an obsession, but such an interest for you to pursue and learn more with purpose?
I've always been a big baseball fan. I first started to follow it in the newspapers around 1954 when I was 6 years old, and it could spread out there were two sections of the paper I read every day: the comics and the sports page. And I would look at the standings and watch the magic numbers at the end of the year. And there was always a lot of that because the Yankees were in the pennant races almost all that period, as were the Giants several years and the Dodgers a lot of years. So I grew up reading the Newark papers, and on Sundays the New York papers along with it. And as I went through, I had a dear friend in growing up in a little town called Clark, New Jersey, who ended up being a major sportscaster and broadcaster in Tokyo, Wayne Grassick. And we would pass notes between class. We played baseball every day, and it was the national pastime at that point in the 50s when we were playing. And I just kind of drove on reading the magazines from Sports Illustrated to Sport Magazine and various things of that nature. And I was always fascinated with the historical pieces on Walter Johnson or Christy Mathewson or Babe Ruth or any of those sort of things. When I got out of college, however, suddenly I had to earn a living, so I kind of fell away a little bit as I started my career in healthcare management, and then get married and a couple kids, and it slows down. And I discovered it when I moved back to the Louisville area in 1981 and joined SABR. So that kind of drives me. And it's just questions go. I'm trying to answer questions, and I'm trying to find good stories.
Yeah, and Lord knows that things like this are good stories. So let's dig into some of that, right? So I do, though, think, before we talk about how Louisville and these three other teams kind of got kicked out of the National League in 1900, it's probably important to kind of understand Louisville's professional beginnings. And we can, I'm sure we could spend a whole hour getting into sort of the tributaries that kind of led up even to that. But this thing called the American Association, which, we've learned over time, right, is or wasn't necessarily, it wasn't sort of at the National League caliber, so to speak, right? And maybe there's some grist into that statement itself. But this American Association maybe is probably helpful for our audience to understand, because it's not the American League. It's this sort of predecessor, but an important one, not only for the American League, but also the National League too, right?
Yeah, the American Association was a competitor of the National Leagues and a quasi-partner of them when the National Agreement pops up in the 1892 season. However, they lasted for about 10 years. Now, you had other leagues that popped up, the Union Association in 1884 and the Players League in 1890, that lasted one season and were gone. But the American Association was a competitor and a partner over a 10-year period. There were battles between them, and the National League always treated the American Association, even when they were co-signatories of the National Agreement, as somewhat of a younger brother and not necessarily a better one. Certainly the National League was better capitalized. They had a little bit of head start from 1876, which Louisville was part of also very briefly until the first big gambling scandal hit in 1877, and Louisville kind of faded away and only lasted 2 years in the National League. But Louisville had a very good semi-pro team called the Eclipse in the late 70s and early 80s. And when the American Association came along, it got started primarily by Western interests from Pittsburgh to St. Louis. And Louisville was a major city in the country at that time. In 1870, they were the 14th largest city in the country. And if you pull out the New York area cities like Brooklyn and Newark that were also part of that metropolitan area, and those that were impractical for baseball like New Orleans and San Francisco, Louisville was closing in on the top 10, bigger than Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Milwaukee, and on. So they were a transportation hub from goods from the south coming north, and also sat on the Ohio River, so a lot of east-west traffic going through there. However, in 1875, businessmen in Louisville wanted to start a professional team. 1869, they had seen how the professional Cincinnati teams, a competitor of Louisville as cities for prominence on the Ohio River, came along and started that up. It happened to be just the same time that William Hulbert was about to launch the National League and escape from the National Association after the 1875 season. And he started with a Western group of teams, St. Louis, Cincinnati, Louisville, and Chicago, as his wedge in to try and then convince the Eastern teams, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, that sort of place, to join him and essentially move from a player-based league to an owner-based league. And he was successful. The first meeting of the group was held in Louisville. It was speculated by some folks that he did that because the president of the Louisville Club was Walter Haldeman, who was the publisher of the Courier-Journal, and he had the power to put a little gag order on all the local newspapers, and nothing would get out before Hulbert went to New York and famously convinced the Eastern teams to join him. And so the National League has been going since, 175 years now?
Sure.
It's a long time. But the association came along, and they were guys, there wasn't such a thing as major leagues in those times. Certainly the National League was at the top of the pyramid, but the American Association came along and said, we're just as good. We'll compete for the same players. They were willing to sign players from the National League. They had a very similar schedule set up and followed much the same rules. There were some minor variations. And on they went through their first season, and they outdrew the National League. Part of that is because the American Association had teams in Philadelphia and New York, and the National League did not. In the late 1870s, Hulbert tossed out New York and Philadelphia because they wouldn't make their final Western road trip. So they were in places like Worcester, Massachusetts, and Troy, New York, and Rochester, and whatnot. And suddenly the American Association was in the big cities and outdrew the National League. The National League approached them, or they approached the National League, because certainly the National League was richer, had more money, and had better posture. Went forward and signed the national agreement that linked them and one minor league into this. The first time we started to see organized baseball come along in the early 1880s. And off we went through the 1880s, and we ended up seeing the beginning of World Series between the American Association and the National League. We saw players traded between leagues. We saw battles to sign players, much like free agency today, because contracts were nowhere near as tight as they were. But we also saw the beginnings of reserve rules and those sort of things, as the leagues and the individual teams were looking to protect their own interests.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because this is also, and we've talked about this on from a number of different angles, right? This is also, it's also important, and the chapters 1 and 2 perhaps of Ken Burns' baseball documentary is helpful on all this, right? Is I want to call it ragtagness, but there's sort of these are sort of still the formative years, right? You're sort of alluding to the term quote unquote professional, right? Because there's a whole bunch of things going on at that time, right? Where things like quote unquote professional baseball is looked upon maybe not necessarily as a noble profession, right?
Certainly it was not.
The rogue factor, right? And all that stuff, right?
The players were not, there was no college players that are being drafted into the major leagues at that time. And these were just guys who had athletic ability, had developed that ability, and just wanted to live the way they wanted to live. They were there were those that were happy-go-lucky. There were lots of drunkards within that bunch. There was a lot of irresponsibility. There was also very good players, very moral players, because you had the whole Sabbatarian issue with Sunday baseball in certain cities, and players who wouldn't play on Sunday and those sort of things. So there was this mixed bag, but the players were not a sophisticated group of people. And neither were the owners, for that matter. They were still trying to figure out how to make this a paying proposition. They'd have good years and bad years. Now, there were teams that consistently made money. Chicago in the National League, Boston in the National League, Philadelphia in the National League, St. Louis in the American Association, Cincinnati in the American Association was kind of up and down. But by and large, over half the teams in both leagues struggled in many, many seasons.
Well, look, and it's also sort of the other sort of angle or rift, right? The National League not necessarily helpfully aiding and abetting the American Association, right? The frankly pejorative or derogatory perception of them as the American Association as the beer and whiskey league, right? It almost feels they were called a lot of times river cities, and not sort of as a positive thing, right? But almost as a perception of sort of a down market and or inferior, I guess, product to the National League thing, right? It just seems that the National League, while I guess on some levels interested in having a semi-competitor and or a World Series or pre-World Series kind of structure near the end, was also at the same time maybe not particularly excited about maybe either the brand of play, the places and or the folks that were sort of part of it. And frankly, I think there was a sanctimony to it, right? Or sanctimoniousness, sorry, where the National League, I guess, was pretty restrictive on things like selling beer at games, for example, and these River City teams, so to speak, embraced it, and maybe arguably is partially why they're doing so well at the gate.
Certainly those issues were throughout the 1870s, 1880s, and into the 1890s. In fact, the blue laws on Sunday baseball don't end for baseball until the 1920s. I think Philadelphia was the last team that still worked in a city that had blue laws that restricted, didn't prohibit Sunday baseball. However, you're exactly correct there. The National League, if you look at their constitution in 1876, their purpose was to control baseball, to make the rules and to kind of be the benign dictator over all of this sort of thing. And I think you're right that they looked down upon the American Association. They certainly, if they had their druthers, there would have been no American Association, and the National League would simply have been at the top of the pyramid and ran things, and very profitably in all probability. However, the American Association, the country, even the Midwest and the East, was just getting too big. There were too many cities growing that could support teams and go forward with this sort of thing, and they couldn't stop that. We will see when we talk about the reduction that in the early 1890s, we first get the term big league, because the National League suddenly became a 12-team league, and there was when they absorbed half of the American Association after a one-year war over certain players being assigned to them out of the Players League debacle.
So let's get into the 1890s then, right? So because that's when this, I guess the characterization is loose affiliation became much more directly and officially connected between this American Association and the National League. Is that correct?
Well, they had always been tied together since the early 1880s through the national agreement. And by the mid 1880s, their playing rules were virtually identical. The differences came in how the leagues operated with the National League assuming the moral high ground of no Sunday baseball, no beer in the ballpark. Whereas when you get to places like Cincinnati and St. Louis and Louisville, these are cities with heavy German populations, Irish populations, and there was no problem in those cities having that sort of entertainment on Sundays and libation at the ballpark. There was also the issue that the American Association was always the cheaper admission league. They would have a bottom price of 25 cents to the bleachers or the end of the grandstands. The National League had a minimum of 50 cents. That certainly helped the National League because as long as they could draw a decent amount of folks, they had more money. And you see that in the signing of players. They could afford more to hold on to players. In the American Association, the only team that was always financially successful and also because of that were competitively successful was the St. Louis Browns of Chris Von der Aa, who had wildly successful brewery, bars, integrated amusements into his ballpark, and did very, very well, won 3 or 4 pennants in a row, and was a competitor, bitter competitor, with Al Spalding's Chicago team.
Well, so it seems like, though, the 90s, though, were kind of a time of sort of it sort of evolved from more of a coordination, I guess, and an understanding into something much more centralized. Wow, what's centralized? But truly more incorporated, so to speak, right? To the point where I guess by the end of the decade, right, you're looking at something that is much more solidified than where the decade kind of started, right?
You certainly are going to see by the time you get to 1900, that is the time when the American League emerges out of the Western League, and Ban Johnson starts to be the competitor of the National League. And we get to what we consider is called sometimes the modern era, because we understand the World Series of that time, an American League versus National League. But I think to a great extent, throughout the 1890s, the leagues were struggling because of some external factors and some internal factors. Externally, in 1893, the country went into recession, and the ball clubs of all sorts had difficulty drawing enough fans in. And in 1895, you start to get this talk of maybe the National League, which is now 12 teams, needs to go back to 8 teams. And how are we going to get there? You had owners like Arthur Sodden in Boston who said, I went through the Union Association and the Players League buyout, where the National League had to buy teams out to get them to leave the field. And he didn't want to have put any more money into that. And now suddenly they're going to have to buy out 4 more teams. And they just wanted them to go away and be careful. And that was part of this whole strategy that they developed to try and drive teams out, because they couldn't make any money during the late 1890s, simply because the national economy wasn't there, and the way that the teams were. A 12-team league means you got to go to a lot more places, and they aren't necessarily wealthy places that have a good ball team. So you lost home games, and suddenly you're on the road more. Expenses were higher, and folks were just struggling to keep franchises afloat.
So that's interesting. So some broader economic situations, right? And it being 12 teams, and again, at the precipice of 1900, right? That almost feels I want to call it sort of almost like a luxury and or unsustainable, or challenging to sustain even in decent economic times, let alone sort of a national sort of economic. But I also get the sense that too, and you kind of danced around it, but maybe I could sort of pinpoint it. There also seems to be, I guess, sort of the beginnings, if you will, of really sort of a concentration of power, so to speak, around this thing called now professional baseball, right? And from our previous conversations in and around sort of this topic, a lot of people seem to kind of focus their energies around maybe this is where the seeds of baseball's now famous monopoly, if you will, or monopsony kind of power, if you will, with federal support and help kind of originated, right? This is, you're talking about buying out other teams, right? Well, that sounds like a monopolist, if you will, at work, right? To get rid of a problem so that we can protect our advantage, fair or otherwise.
Well, certainly the 1880s and 1890s, we're in the middle of the Gilded Age, robber barons and all of those sort of things. Baseball was not the level of Standard Oil or the big trusts that were going, but they acted like it within their own world. The idea that they could make their own rules and operate starting in 1879 with the reserve rule, whereby teams could have a call on players for the next season rather than have contracts run out and players were free agents. It was a way to it did two things. They were trying to keep salaries down because the players had no place else to go. And the other thing was if you were a good team, you got to keep your good players and nobody else was going to buy them out from you. And these rules started to flow through all the way through into the 1890s, whereby teams were just looking to protect themselves and they were trying to compete within themselves. There are stories of fights over schedules. I want 4th of July at home. No, I've got to have Memorial Day here. Boston has to have Patriot Day, all these sort of things. In 18 1898, they tried to run Louisville out of the league by they had 14 Sunday games, and they took all but 3 of them away from them, hoping that they would lose money and just go away, and they would have one less team to have to buy out. But the owner of the little team, Barney Dreyfus, who's a big part of the story in 1899 and 1900, was just a shrewder, harder fighter than that, and he was able to recapture most of his Sunday games.
Well, okay. So as we kind of keep getting closer to sort of the Big Bang, so to speak, in 1899, it also though strikes me though that from what I understand, the play, if you will, and sort of the dynamics of actually playing the games and the season and the competition and stuff, that too was I don't know if it was fraying or devolving, but that was quite a spectacle too. I mean, it was not uncommon, not only for, the drinking and the roguishness and stuff and the various sort of levels of that, depending on what city you were in. But it seems like it was, I guess, bawdy and rowdy were sort of kind and gentle terms to kind of describe maybe how some of the dynamics of the actual play were sort of unfolding during that time.
Certainly the 1890s, Bill James in his historic almanac says, dirty baseball ruled the day. Those were the times where you tripped people, gave them a hit when they're coming around second base so that they couldn't get through. You cut bases. There were all sorts of things going on, spiking players, those sorts of things. And the quintessential team of that was the old Orioles, John McGraw, Wilbur Robertson, and that sort of thing. But the Cleveland team with Patsy Tebow was very much like that. And Charlie Comiskey in St. Louis in the American Association was not above those things either.
Yeah. Now, if I'm a Hollywood screenwriter potentially, that sounds like that could be great fodder for a. I guess fun is not maybe the right word, right? But I mean, how would you characterize that? Was it sort of just roguish and anything goes, but it had boundaries to it, or was it? Did it sort of, spill into nefariousness and or criminality and any of that kind of stuff, right? I mean, it sounds like it was just an amazingly interesting and perhaps arguably wildly fun kind of experience, but I got to think that maybe it got a little out of hand, or maybe a lot out of hand in certain situations too.
It did. There are stories of the Baltimore Orioles in the 1890s letting the grass grow deeper in the outfield so they could hide baseballs. So if one was hit too deep, they could just pick one up as they were running along and throw it back in. John McGraw was known, he was a third baseman at that time, was known to kind of hook his finger over the belt of a runner at third. So on a potential sacrifice fly, they would be delayed a little bit. There's a story that Pete Browning of Louisville one time felt him doing that, unhitched his belt and ran anyway. And McGraw was just left there standing there holding his belt while he scored the run. But there were all sorts of things going on. It was part of the rise of the American League was Van Johnson was trying to wash a lot of that away. And he did that through unquestionable support for his umpires. The players were just ruthless. They would hit umpires. The fans would throw things at them. There were regular melees on the field. They would pull their team off if they didn't like a decision that was given. Lots of forfeits. It was not a fan-friendly sort of atmosphere.
All right. Well, so you set the table then. So let's get a little closer to the dramatic situation and the trigger being pulled after the 1899 season. You're describing a league of 12 teams. We've gotten into kind of the dynamics of it, the divisions, if you will, the the challenges of the broader economy and all that kind of stuff. So give us a sense, and obviously as a world expert in the former Louisville Colonels part of this, maybe set the table as to sort of what leads up and to specifically kind of what the dynamics were around this desire, this intention, if you will, to slim down and maybe even a little bit to get us going into why the four teams, in particular, Louisville included, were circled as the ones to kind of be lopped off.
By the mid 1890s, it was pretty obvious to most observers that the 12-team league wasn't working, financially or competitively. With 12 teams, you had way too many teams out of the pennant race long before July 4th. Therefore, you couldn't make expenses when you travel to those places. And Louisville.
By the way, I didn't mean to interrupt, but this is also, is this still around kind of the time when teams wouldn't necessarily always play the same amount of games, like there was sort of the lopsided sort of schedules and stuff, or was this literally you had to play full out schedules?
They didn't make up all of the games that might be rained out, or if a train got delayed and you couldn't get to town for a couple of days. If particularly late in the season, if there were no open dates, you wouldn't make those up. So there were variations, but they weren't big. You're talking 5-6 game sort of variations in a 100 to 120 game schedule.
Got it. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but yeah, okay, makes sense.
So, but there were a lot of open dates because teams tended to play exhibition games as they were traveling to try and make some more money as they would go along, which was a managers who could schedule lucrative exhibition games were highly prized, even if they weren't particularly good at managing a team as they went through. But back to the difficulties of the league. Monetarily, because of the national economy, 12 teams weren't working, and there were two lines of thought of what they needed to do. One line was, let's get back to 8 teams. We can make it work that way. It worked in the past. We'll just get rid of 4 teams, and let's find a way to do it as cheaply as we can. The other thought, and this came from Ned Hanlon, who was owner-manager of the Baltimore team, said, let's add teams back to 16 and we'll have our 2 leagues again, and off we go. However, Hanlon may have been a little bit disingenuous there because his team was one of those that was going to be gone. However, what was going on within the leagues is that you had developing since 1890 what was called syndicate baseball. This is where individual owners would own pieces of multiple teams in the league. Brooklyn and Baltimore were owned by the same people and had an interlocking directory running those teams. Cleveland and St. Louis was owned by the Robson brothers. And we end up with the 1899 Cleveland Spiders, the god-awful team, most losses and lowest winning percentage under 200 for a team ever, because the Robesons also owned St. Louis. They moved all their good players, including people like Cy Young, from Cleveland to St. Louis. You had Chicago, Boston, a number of teams had a piece of the New York Giants because they were struggling at the gate in those days. Brooklyn was having trouble, on and on and on. So the idea that we can get another league going and go back to this 1880s when we were doing fairly well with 2 8-team leagues didn't really go very far. And in fact, people tried to gin up a new American association. You saw late in the 1890s the development of Ban Johnson trying to maneuver his Western League, renamed the American League, into Major League status, which he successful with by 1901, but he was still a minor league operation when this was all going on. The owners were trying to say that the only way to get folks out is either bankrupt them or pay them off and get them gone. And there were all sorts of machinations going on, from cooking the schedules to signing all the good players from a team to the better teams. But the teams that were targeted, Baltimore, Louisville, Washington, and Cleveland. Brooklyn was also in that list occasionally, were just bottom feeders. They just could not, they were undercapitalized teams who either had trouble at home, Cleveland example of this, where they just were back to the morality question. The people didn't want Sunday baseball, and they couldn't live without Sunday baseball. So when they bought the St. Louis team, they just moved all their good players over there and essentially abandoned Cleveland and played all their games on the road. Louisville's problems was chronically undercapitalized. Going back to 1876, Louisville would have a good budget. In the 1890s, their goal was to get a $50,000 capitalization. They rarely got more than $20,000. And you're not going to compete with the Chicagos and Bostons and Philadelphias of the world on a short bankroll. Therefore, you're signing lots of new players. We didn't have the minor leagues like we had today that the majors could own them, where they could call players up and down. They have a farm system they could pull from. So it always cost you money to bring somebody up, and you weren't quite sure they were doing well. Baltimore's problem was good teams, no fans would come. For some reason, Baltimore was not, in those days, a very good baseball town. And Brooklyn's problem was, I'm not quite sure what Brooklyn's problem was. They had plenty of population. They had a decent owner and a decent team, but they just couldn't draw very well. And these were the teams they're saying, pick 4 of the 5 and let's get rid of them. And then we'll have our old 8-team league and off we go again. The difficulty was they couldn't quite figure out how to do it cheaply. When they've raised the issue directly with the teams around the late 1898 and said, okay, we want you 4, Louisville, Cleveland, Baltimore, and Washington, just go away. They said, fine, but we want a lot of money. They were asking for around $150,000 to $200,000 in compensation to go away. Nobody wanted to pay that.
Well, and some of those were actually for sale, right? Where they were kind of also they were. Yeah, they were. So even more resistance, I guess, to paying off a couple of teams that were for sale, right?
Right, but if they sold them to somebody with more capital, suddenly you wouldn't be able to get rid of them even more so, because nobody's going to buy something just to have it bought out from underneath them. Louisville was for sale. Cleveland was for sale. Baltimore always struggled. Washington said they would sell their team if somebody would buy it. But nobody wanted to be the first guy out, and they wanted as much money as they could get from the established league, the National League, to go away. In the end, the National League did achieve that to some extent when they bought them out, but that's why they didn't close out in 1898. Now, they had another problem. When the Players League went belly up in 1890, and after the little war between the American Association and National League in 1891, a new national agreement was signed that formed the 12-team big league. Within that, there was a clause that said, these are the 12 teams that are in there. This agreement will run for 10 years, and you can't drop somebody from the league without their consent during that period. So the National League was stuck with 12 teams till 1902 if nobody was willing to go. That's why they kept asking for more money, because they knew they had the leverage to ask.
So let's also now throw in Barney Dreyfuss, previously mentioned, right? Because he's integral to this story, and surprisingly to me, even more so down the road as a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame and all that stuff. But his he was the owner of the Louisville club, right? Maybe a little bit of an entree of him into this mix, because he plays a pretty crucial role in a lot of this.
He certainly did. Dreyfuss bought some stock in the Louisville team around 1895.
And I'm sorry, he's kind of a liquor guy by trade, yeah.
His family was. Barney was a German national who came to this country in the early 1880s. After some cousins of his came here about 10 years earlier, the Bernheim brothers. The Bernheim brothers had set up a distillery in Paducah, Kentucky, far western Kentucky, and a few years later moved it to Louisville. They are the ones who developed I.W. Harper bourbon. And if nobody knows that, go watch the James Bond film on His Majesty's Secret Service. That's what Bond drinks during that movie. But I.W. Harper was a very high-end bourbon whiskey, and they were doing very well. Barney went out to Paducah and worked as a clerk for a while, moved back to Louisville. And it was his cousins who owned this. They were the Bernheim brothers. He was related to them on his mother's side of the family. He was a clerk there. He had some health problems. We're not sure what it was. But he was also a big, big fan of baseball for some reason. And off he goes to invests in the Louisville team in 1895. He becomes secretary and a board member by the end of 1895, and accumulates enough stock in the next 2 years that he's the president of the club. And Dreyfuss is pragmatic and shrewd. Don't ever, he's the kind of guy, when you shake hands with him, when you let go, count your fingers, because he knows how to make things happen. He knew pretty clearly by the end of 1898, Louisville wasn't going to survive one more year. Either the leagues were going to bounce them out, force them out, bankrupt them, and he ended up he wanted to stay in baseball, so he started looking for another team to buy. He looked at St. Louis, he looked at Chicago, he focused on Pittsburgh, and that's where we know him the best, because he did end up buying the Pittsburgh Pirate franchise immediately before the leagues bought out all the teams. He got about 47%, and he bought the rest of it within 2 years.
So let me back up for a second. So this shrewdness of his, he had so he's basically angling to kind of gain full control of the Colonels, knowing that they're not sort of long, because they don't have their right dance partners. They've been they finished last, I think, in 1899, right? That season, right? So
no, they were close to. I think they were 11th out of 12. But you're essentially correct. They were a sorry franchise. Was he intending on, or maybe better term, going through the motions to show that Louisville was going to play in 1900, but all the while kind of knowing, and then sort of angling to find another sort of place, I guess, in Pittsburgh to kind of have an angle? I think that's a correct assumption on this, that he was playing for time. He was trying to maneuver to where he would have the most leverage somewhere, and to have that leverage, Louisville couldn't be dropped from the league. He had to have something in there that gave people a reason to not ignore him. He did some in 1899, and I just found this about 2 years ago at the Hall of Fame. He got Louisville to, when he sold his stock at the end of October of 1899 in the Louisville club while he was looking to buy another club. Pittsburgh was his number one target. He bought an option to control all the reserve players on the Louisville team. That includes players like Honus Wagner, Fred Clark, Rube Waddell, Claude Ritchie, Tommy Leach, a very nice group of players.
Some of them Hall of Famers, by the way.
Two of them, three of them are Hall of Famers, although Waddell was just kind of a packet of potential at this time. He really didn't develop until around 1902. But he was this hard-throwing, happy-go-lucky kind of guy who gave manager Fred Clark all sorts of problems. But several hundred other stories out there about Clark and Waddell. But he controlled them, and it was that control that allowed him to buy Pittsburgh because he could deliver the Louisville players. But the leagues were still trying to get rid of teams, and his trying to buy Pittsburgh was in the middle of all this machinations that were going on. The National League set up what they called a circuit reduction committee in the mid-1899, trying to figure out who should go and how much should they pay them. It had two purposes. One, the number one purpose was to get rid of teams, get back to an 18 league. Number two, they had to hold off Ban Johnson trying to move the Western Association into a major league status, and a attempt by the Spinks in St. Louis, who ran the Sporting News, and Francis Richter, who ran Sporting Life in Philadelphia, to sporting weeklies, to restart the American Association. They signed Cap Anson as the president of this new organization. They had John McGraw interested in running the Baltimore franchise, owning the Baltimore franchise. And this was something that worried the owners in the National League. What are we going to do if we buy out these teams? We're short of money, and we still have competition out there.
So there's an existential threat to the National League from potential competitors then. And so I guess, does the logic basically mean that shrinking down to 8 teams will strengthen us as well as help our immediate financial cash flow to protect and or whatever from the outside threats?
Yes, that was the thought process, because they had different sense of seriousness about the various teams that could leagues that could compete with them, and they were trying to make it that the teams couldn't compete with them. One of the reasons they were slow in buying out teams is they were trying to continue to control those territories as far into the future as they could, so that this new American Association or Ban Johnson and the Western Association couldn't move east into some territories that the National League exits. So they were trying to continue to control that land, ballparks, and players if they could, even if they got rid of the franchises.
So how does the deed? So we could probably go another hour on sort of the syndicate model or the insider dealing, shall we say, of the owners. The fact that a Dreyfus could actually, own essentially one team and then buy access to another team, and then, frankly, as we've seen in other situations, he ultimately takes all the best stuff of Louisville, especially after they're contracted, and brings them over to Pittsburgh. And lo and behold, Pittsburgh is a solid team almost out of the gate. But how does the deed get done then? I mean, take us in the room if you can, to the extent that and have learned it.
On Dreyfus's end with Louisville, he had his option ran out at the end of December 1899. So he had to cut a deal before then. And the National League was trying to extend the period that they still controlled the territory, so they weren't going to buy out these teams until late in the winter or early spring, because to keep a check on other leagues moving into those territories. So Dreyfus used this option that he had on there. He bought the option for like $5,000. Louisville owed 3 or 4 banks in Louisville. They owed with mortgages on their property. They didn't own their ballpark. That was owned by some of the directors, so they didn't quite have the assets to do that. But they also owed Barney some money. They owed several of the other directors money. They probably owed somewhere in the neighborhood of $35,000, and they didn't have. I doubt seriously they had $5,000 cash on hand. So when Dreyfus pays them $5,000 for the option, they at least have enough money to continue into the new year. But part of that option is if Dreyfus did deliver the players to another team, he would pay Louisville $25,000. So Louisville is listening to it very carefully. They have to stay alive so that they control those players under Barney's option through whatever the transaction gets done. They are successful with that. Barney buys Pittsburgh in December of 1899. The deal is closed late December, and they elect Dreyfus president of the club early January, and he's free and clear. Louisville has paid off most of their debts. They probably still owe somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000, but they're also now trying to get a payment from the National League to make them go away. They want $20,000, $25,000. National League doesn't want to pay that. Louisville does not own their ballpark, and their ballpark burned down in August of 1899. So they didn't have a lot of assets. However, they went forward. When Dreyfus finished his transaction with Pittsburgh, the problem Louisville had is they had no players because all their reserve players went to Pittsburgh. So the president of the National League said, "You don't have a team anymore. We're just going to let you go away." They quickly made a trade with Pittsburgh, got 4 players, signed, drafted 6 other players, had 10 players under contract, so they were still alive. In the end, they ended up getting $10,000, essentially paid off all their debts, and everybody just went away. The other teams, places like Cleveland, Baltimore, and Washington, either owned their ballparks or had a property that was owned by the ball club. And in the end, the National League paid somewhere between $100,000 and $120,000 to the 4 teams to get them to go away. Louisville flirted with the American League and made an effort to join the new American Association. But when they did, just to give you an idea of how difficult it was for Louisville to raise money, they set a budget of $50,000 to incorporate a new team after the old one was bought out, and they raised $16,000. It just wasn't going to work. Louisville, to this day, is the only one of the teams that was dropped from the National League in 1900 who never became a major league team again. Now, they've been a wildly successful minor league team in the very high minors from 1903 to today. They're the first team to draw 1 million fans in the minor leagues in 83 or 84. But they are never going to be a major league team. Louisville got past the population boom of the Gilded Age, passed Louisville by. Suddenly they were by 1900, they're the 25th or 30th largest city in the country, and we started to see the Great Lakes cities grow and that sort of thing. So Louisville is where they belong right now in the high minors.
Yeah, so all of that's really interesting because it really does, and there's a bunch of other angles to the story for other episodes, right? You're talking about the arrival of other leagues, the expansion, I guess, of interest of baseball, the certainly the solidification of some of these issues around sort of monopoly or trying to sort of centralize power and control, the beginnings of the, obviously the labor issues that sort of come with that, the joint ownerships, so many dramatic sort of pieces to this. But as we sort of round third here, let's I guess sort of talk about maybe sort of the things that sort of have evolved because of it. I mean, obviously Louisville not attaining that top tier major league status again. Where would you, as the main historian for all of this, right? You're probably the best person to ask this question. In your mind, where would you place the legacy, the soul, and even maybe the statistical records and the other sort of historical artifacts, I guess, of this original Louisville Cardinals? I knew I knew at some point I was going to say that. The Colonel's legacy and story. Is it in the soul of the Pittsburgh Pirates? He asks somewhat naively, but maybe not so.
No, I don't think so. Well, certainly the core of the Louisville players end up in Pittsburgh, and Barney Dreyfuss ends up in Pittsburgh, as does the secretary of the Louisville team, Harry Pulliam, who then in 1902 or 1903 became president of the National League. Louisville ends up moving lock, stock, and barrel pretty much to Pittsburgh, but there's no real sense that Louisville continues on. You don't, partially because franchises in the 1880s and 1890s came and went at a clip we wouldn't recognize today. When you look at the St. Louis Browns of the American Association in the 1880s, they are the ancestor of the St. Louis Cardinals. When they moved to the National League, that's who it was that came on through. The Philadelphia Athletics is a name that was used by half a dozen teams in pro baseball, and they had no connection to Connie Mack, Oakland, and the various movements to Kansas City and Oakland that they've had. But no, I don't see Louisville being connected there. I think they just end. At the end of the 1899 season, Louisville is done. They're no longer a member of the National League. They never again will be. There's no real connection to them. Pittsburgh was a standalone franchise for many years, at least a decade before they received the Louisville players. They have their own history.
Okay, so I guess that makes sense. But I'll one last sort of devil's advocate then, though. Could you make the argument that, Dreyfuss's arrival to Pittsburgh in what we've already established was a relatively crucial time in baseball's history, given all the new competition and the arrival of the American League and the rebirth of the AA and all that stuff, and clearly, obviously, various innovations, right, that Dreyfuss sort of brought into the mix. Now, did they originate in Louisville? Probably not, but consider the inventor of the World Series, for example, obviously a baseball Hall of Famer, voted in literally just about a decade ago. Or am I giving him too much credit for his contributions to the Pirates? I mean, I guess this is another story for another day around sort of how solid were the Pittsburgh Pirates at the time, and, was Dreyfuss himself, as well as what he brought to the table from the Louisville franchise, a significant injection of good stuff that could or should be. But it seems to me that you're kind of you're guardrailing that Louisville existence and cordoning that off from the Pittsburgh Pirates' ongoing success since.
I think so. I don't see anything in Louisville's history that, other than they were able to acquire some potentially very good players. They traditionally had terrible starts to seasons, even with Honus Wagner and Fred Clark from 1896, 1897, 1890, back into 1895. I don't think they ever finished higher than ninth of the 12-team league in the 1890s after they won the pennant in 1890. they fell off very quickly. However, I think Dreyfus learned a great deal of how to wade through the political waters of the National League through his ownership of the Louisville Colonels. And when he goes to Pittsburgh, he is a key figure in bringing up the peace between the American League and the National League. Now, he does that in his own self-interest because part of the deal is American League won't put a team in Pittsburgh. And he wins that one. He gets together with the Boston American League owner in 1903, and they sign their own deal to hold the World Series. And in 1904, John Brush and John McGraw say, I'm not going to play that upstart American League, and we don't have a World Series, but we end up with the Brush rules in 1905, and we've had, other than 1994, we've had the World Series ever since. Dreyfus was also one of the first to build a massive stadium when he built Forbes Field around, 1908, 1909. This was a marvel that suddenly we had this concrete and steel ballpark that was just massive for the time. You got to remember that the fate of ballparks up until the concrete and steel period was they burned down. There are none of them left anymore. None of them, most of the times when you got a new stadium, it's because the old one burned. Those were the difficulties with wooden ballparks. But Dreyfus also was going through, and he was critical to the league in the 1917, 1918 period, getting them through the war years. And Pittsburgh had fallen on tougher times. After about 1910, they weren't as strong a team, but Dreyfus was one of the critical owners throughout his period. Dreyfus stayed president of the Pittsburgh Pirates until 1932 when he died. And then it was taken over by his wife and ultimately by his son-in-law, Bill Benswanger, who ran the team till like 1946. So it was almost a 50-year run of the Dreyfus family running Pittsburgh.
All right, I'm going to beat a dead horse, but we're always interested in this little show, and this is our little niche, so we dig deep into it and solidify it by each and every episode. We're always interested to sort of understand potentially. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward. Sometimes, and many times actually, it's not. Is to where these various histories of things that have dead-ended themselves, so to speak, kind of could legitimately reside, right? And there's various aspects to that, right? The monetary gains, could we resurrect the logos and, make some money off of that? But frankly, it's also history, right? Where's the right sort of sided, domiciling of history that came, who's got the rights to it legitimately? I guess where I would always just generally ask the question, and maybe you don't know the answer to that, maybe you don't have an opinion, maybe you do. Where do you think then this Colonel's history, which by the way, we didn't even talk about, but they did win the American Association Championship in 1890, which happened to be Dreyfus's first year of ownership, right? And that itself was an interesting story because they were generally a moribund franchise, but they kind of literally went sort of that worst to first kind of thing and won it all in proceeding back to their woeful ways shortly thereafter. But is any of this history remembered, domiciled anywhere? Does the current minor league franchise lay claim to it because it was Louisville? Do people care? Or is it just kind of truly withered away and you and I are the only ones maybe talking about it?
No. There are folks in Louisville, and there are old American Association fans, not those that visited the games, who still remember Louisville. Louisville, when they reappeared in the American Association in 1983, had a major display going back into their major league days in the concourse at the stadium, and all of those photographs and pictures that they have I assume is in the Slugger Park now, downtown, since they moved out of the fairgrounds about 10 years ago. But they do follow a little bit. Pete Browning is still a fairly well-known name, the star player, particularly through the 1880s. You'll hear the name Chicken Wolf and Guy Hecker pop up in stories in the Courier Journal from time to time. And then you've got really oddball people like me who study these things and write about them. I've written extensively about Hecker and the god-awful Louisville team in 1889 that became, as you say, the first to go worst to first, winning the pennant in 1890, making it to the World Series, which got several games snowed out in Brooklyn. Another set of stories.
All right, last question.
I think Louisville is gone, but they are not forgotten. There are people that are interested in the 19th century game, and certainly Louisville from 1876 to 1900 was a key part of these sort of things, and they have a rich history to grab onto.
All right, last question, and it does bring us into sort of 2020, 2021 terms. What is your sense of the current Bats franchise's opportunity for survival and success, given the minor league baseball contraction, the COVID situation we're all in, and I guess what seems to be also now encroaching success from the USL Louisville soccer franchise and just other dynamics. What of minor league baseball in Louisville and, just baseball in general in Louisville? Healthy, questionable, worried for it? What?
I think it's healthy. The fortunate part for Louisville in all the machinations of the major leagues trying to slim down their minor leagues is that all the cuts are coming at the bottom, and the rookie leagues in the A leagues, some in the double A leagues. Louisville's sitting there at the triple A level, and I don't think after the reorganization back in the late 90s that did away with the American Association and you just have the Pacific Coast League and the American Association, there are whatever number of teams are in the major leagues, that's how many teams are going to be in AAA. The majors need AAA teams for a couple of reasons. One, they don't do a lot of developing of players at that level. That happens more at the AA level. But it is a staging area when they need to get somebody who's hurt or to bring up somebody that's hot to fill in for a doubleheader or somebody that gets hurt. I don't think that Louisville draws well. They don't draw as spectacularly as they did in the 1980s, but they're a solid franchise, and they will continue. Louisville has had professional softball. You mentioned the soccer team. There was a professional hockey team for a while. They don't seem to last much. It's by and large a college town between University of Kentucky and the University of Louisville in interest, and just count the pages in the sports section. You get a picture of that. But the Louisville Bats are a downtown ballpark. The owners who are active within the community, I think they're going to be just fine in the near and intermediate future.
Well, be careful. Our basketball pal Dan Issel, very, very interested in trying to get the Kentucky Colonels sort of resurrected from their old ABA days into an NBA franchise. And God bless, we continue to root for his success to somehow get an NBA franchise. So maybe there's a little glimmer of top-tier professional resuscitation, so to speak. And
that's possible. And when you say Dan Issel and I were classmates at the University of Kentucky. My roommate had several classes with him, and Dan was the hero of the basketball team in those days. But he is also wildly successful in his retirement with his horse farms and breeding operations and whatnot. And there's always talk of bringing a professional basketball team to Louisville, and it just doesn't quite work out. They're going to have issues of scheduling at the Yum Center because the University of Louisville controls that. They're going to have to figure that sort of thing out. The community is split almost 50-50 between UK and U of L and basketball loyalties and whatnot. It has always been difficult to sustain any sort of professional operation other than the historic baseball team at the AAA level in Louisville.
All righty then. Thank you so much to Bob for a wonderfully interesting and intriguing conversation about a topic that I now know a lot more about for sure. And let's see, the article is called 4 Teams Out, the National League Reduction of 1900. It is authored by Bob Bailey. It came out in 1990. It is part of a wonderful compilation just out now from our friends at the University of Nebraska Press called SABR 50 at 50, the Society for American Baseball Research's 50 most essential contributions to the game. It is in a beautiful hardcover edition. It is an amazing collection of a tremendous survey of articles that truly kind of give you the heart and the spirit. Some of it statistical, some of it curious, some of it comical, but altogether a wonderful exploration of the history of baseball in convenient written book form. Of course, you can purchase a copy of that wherever fine books are found. And of course, if you'd like to buy it through our website and give us a couple of shekels of love, keep our lights on during the holidays, we couldn't appreciate that more. And of course, you go to our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, search up this episode. I think it's 191. Yeah, with Bob Bailey. And you will find a convenient link to this book. And frankly, all the other great stuff that you can have delivered overnight or the next day via Amazon Prime, whatever. And like I said, we'll get a couple of a very small amount of pixie dust to put into our coffers, like I said, to keep our lights and now the heat as the winter months approach on, to keep this little show coming your way each and every week. While you're on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com, you can also search up all of our old episodes. Every stinking single, absolute one of them are there. All 190 or so are there for you to stream, to download, to share with your friends, do whatever you want. And of course, any of the books featured there, of course, or other forms of media, if somebody, one of our guests was promoting something at the time, you can buy those books or items there through those links in those episodes as well. Of course, the easiest way to enjoy all of our old episodes is to subscribe to us, for God's sakes, on your favorite podcast player, whatever that might be. Is it Spotify? Is it still Apple? Is it Google Podcasts? Is it Stitcher? Doesn't matter. It's Pandora, whatever. You know, we're everywhere. You can even just stream us directly on YouTube if you'd like. But whatever, for however you do it, just subscribe to us. And then, of course, if there's an opportunity in that podcatcher environment to rate and review us, hopefully favorably, we'd appreciate that a lot, because that helps other people like you find, discover, and hopefully enjoy this show, and they'll tell 2 friends and so on and so on. And it'll be an amazing experience as we get more and more listeners into our little merry band of listenership. We appreciate that. You can also, of course, follow us on social media. On Twitter, you'll find us at Good Seats Still. On Instagram, you'll find us at Good Seats Still Available. You will find a Facebook page devoted to us. You want to send us an email? Go right ahead. We're at hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And yeah, we even have a weekly newsletter. Just go to the website and search up, I don't know exactly what tab it's in, but you'll find it. It's relatively easy to find. Just send us your email and your name, and you'll be you're in. You're good to go. You're in the little VIP club, and you'll know hopefully over the weekend as to what our next upcoming episode shall be. Let's see. Last but not least, of course, You know him, you love him, you can't live without him. He is the great, the one, the only Dr. Jerry Payne in the Atlanta metropolitan area. Thank you, sir, for your twiddling of knobs and editing of virtual videotape or audio tape. We appreciate it as always. That's Jerry Payne Audio Excellence. And I wish you nothing but excellence for the next week and then some. Hang tight, hang tough, everybody. Holiday season, I guess, is approaching. And please, whatever you do during the Thanksgiving holiday and whatever, please be safe. Please be smart. Use those masks. And let's all get through this together. And we want to see you right here next week with your earbuds present for another fun-filled episode of your favorite podcast. Wink, wink. All right. Thanks for listening. We'll hopefully talk to you next week. Please, again, be safe, everybody. And bye-bye.